Thank you. And after Mickey settles, we can go, Tom,
I'm doing.
anytime.
Jimmy, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate your time.
You're very welcome.
If you don't mind, if you would say your name and spell your name for us, please.
Okay. My name is James Buttimer, Buttimer.
And then, just if you wouldn't mind, just talk about yourself a little bit. You know, where you were born, where you were educated, and sort of how you see yourself as a Savannaian and a person of faith. if you
Okay.
would.
I was actually born in Glen Burnie, Maryland, right outside of Baltimore. The reason being, my father went to Catholic University. My mother was raised in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And she met my father at Catholic University. They got married, and my older brother and myself were both born up there. I was 6 months old when they came back to Savannah.
Still counts.
That's right. That's right, non-native. And so my early education was at St. James Catholic School. At the time, it was actually considered a mission. The nuns that came down to taught us were from Pennsylvania, from outside of Philly, the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and they're still there. But this was considered mission territory for the Catholic Church, and so St. James Church originally was a mission church. And I'd say probably, you know, it was interesting, a third of the school was probably Protestant. And that also followed me into my high school years at Benedictine, where probably a third of the school was Jewish. On Jewish holidays, you know, it was a different place. So, so that you could see that the services that the church provided were welcomed by a wide variety of people in the city, not just Catholics. And then after I went to the University of Georgia for a couple of years, but then I dropped out and I worked construction probably for 25 years until I hurt my back. And in my 40s, went back to college and finished my undergraduate degree and then got a master's in history at Armstrong. And then following that, I ended up going into the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association, and I worked on the docks at Georgia Port Authority for about 3 years, and had recently retired not too long ago.
Congratulations.
Well, it's really funny, though, because people ask you, how do you enjoy your retirement? And I'm like, well, I've lost 3 good friends.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
It's not kind of what I was thinking the golden years were going to bring, you know, but so I'm struggling with that now. And that's been, and I'm trying to find ways to get active in other things, you know, and this project is very dear to my heart. I welcome it.
If you would talk a little bit about, I mean, growing up, your family. How many kids? Where'd you go to church? What are some of those wonderful sort of Catholic memories, if you will, or community Catholic memories, if you will?
Well, I came from a big family, a big Irish Catholic family. There were 7 boys, and we went to St. James. We were in St. James Parish. Went to St. James School. You know, and it was. I can remember. Gosh, it must have been in the late 50s. There was a hurricane that came in, and the school bus couldn't run. So Monsignor Toomey, who was the pastor of St. James, actually drove around in his big Buick and picked us up and took us to school and this sort of thing. it was just so different back then. Savannah was, you still had that really old sense of Savannah. None of the roads had been widened yet, and all. You had these big, massive trees everywhere. It was just a really special looking place. And so we went. We were in St. James Parish, and at that time, we had at an early age, like I was in fifth grade, I think, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I can remember the nun that was in charge. She was very young. It was her first assignment to come down to Georgia from Pennsylvania. And she was so shook up, she couldn't speak. And she came in and just wrote it on the blackboard. And and I did, and at that point I was 10 years old. I didn't understand what was going on or why this would happen, but of course, the Irish were head over heels, with Kennedy being elected and this being a representation of cementing your place in the greater society and that sort of thing. But when I was a young child, my grandmother and grandfather still lived downtown. They lived on Huntington Street between Price and Habersham. And we used to go down there and stay. And my grandmother was really old school. She never learned how to drive. And when we stayed with her every morning, we'd get up, and usually my older brother, Joseph, and myself, and she would take us to the cathedral for Mass. And the first thing she would teach you when you went in was where the poor box was. And you never passed the poor box without putting something in it. Even if it was a nickel, you gave. So, and I was out of my father's family, there were two girls, and both of them joined the Sisters of Mercy, the local religious order, and both of them had and when I was real young, the older aunt, my Aunt Betty, who was actually known as Sister Bridget, she was up in Baltimore training and all at that point, and the younger sister, Helen Marie, was still going through St. Vincent's, and then she too ended up going into the order, and she was actually the principal of St. Vincent's for several years, and I really attribute a lot of what I was really taught and showed about. I'm not religion in a way, but even beyond the religion, what it was responding to was through the women in the family, and it was through my aunts, it was through my grandmother, my mother, and my aunts, my brothers, my father's sister-in-laws and all, and they were the ones that really seemed to. When I think back on it, I mean, it's almost all of the teaching I had and the learning I had about religion, about God, about spirituality came from them. And so, and then, so when I went back to school, I was in my 40s, and I decided at that point that I would like to do something. When you get to the master's level, you have to show proficiency with primary sources. And nobody had ever done any primary source material research on the religious order that was here. And so I decided, well, just to honor their vocation, that I would take that on as my master's thesis, and I would do a history of the religious order in Savannah. It was formed by Bishop John England, who was from Cork in Ireland, and he actually came to Charleston in 1820 and then in 1829 established a religious order there, and in 1845 they branched out to Savannah. And you could really, to see the need for it, I mean, it was just when you look at that year, 1845, the Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital had 7 times the number of Irish in it than any other ethnic group. And remarkably, they were the only ethnic group that included women. There were 16 Irish women in the poorhouse and hospital. And you just had this sense of the trauma that the people were experiencing during that famine era, and the height of violence, alcoholism, mental illness was just unbelievable. And it was women, again, who organized the whole enterprise of bringing a religious order to Savannah. And they actually, on the entrance to St. Vincent's up above it, it's the old slogan of Constantine when his whole army converted to Christianity, and had a sign of the cross and it said, "In this sign you will conquer." And they took that and they marched through the worst parts of the old fort in Yamacraw, the 2 slums on the east and west side of the city, through these areas. And they ended up having a series of fundraisers and all, and so they ended up bringing the order to Savannah. And what was really remarkable about this was the fact that a lot of the women who were in the religious order had emigrated from Ireland specifically to join that religious order. They didn't come looking for work or husbands, but it was because of the Bishop John England. He was very well known in Ireland. He came from Cork. His family had suffered through an eviction, through the loss of many members of the family due to disease and starvation. And what had happened there in Ireland at that time were the women from the southwest, in particular the province of Munster, they really made these organizations that addressed the issues of poverty, hunger, disease. So they brought that with them to Savannah, which was really immense. The first Mother Superior of the order, she came over in 1834. And actually there was another woman with her that came. They were from Cork and Kerry. And they came with Bishop England. And this was very interesting because what happened at that time, you had a real vicious nativist movement that was going on, mostly in New England, but it was coming down into mid-Atlantic states too. So they were supposed to land, I think, in Boston. And what happened was it was a nativist crowd, and it was led by Lyman Beecher, who was the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So he was also an abolitionist. But the deal was there was a large portion of abolitionists who were also nativists. Not all of them. There weren't. A lot of them didn't agree with that too. But they ended up, as they were approaching Boston, they burned an orphanage in Charlestown, Massachusetts, over the heads of the nuns and the orphans as they were running for their lives. And this started this big, massive outbreak of violence that went all down the eastern seaboard, down as far as probably Maryland. And it was several churches burned, the institutions they were trying to establish, but there was also some murders, there was deaths in the street, so they couldn't land. And what happened was the mayor of Charleston found out about this, and he got 250 of the leading Protestant families in Charleston that signed an agreement that they would protect not only the sisters, but their institutions. They had a school and an orphanage. And so this was their first impression when they came to America, was the nativism in the North and the tolerance. It wasn't that there wasn't prejudice, but it was it was much lower. It wasn't nearly as intense as it was in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states. So this stayed with them all the way up to the outbreak of the Civil War. The same women were still in charge of the order at that time, and it was just what I see. And then they actually worked, and they went to Augusta in 1839 during a very bad yellow fever epidemic, and the head of the medical school there died. But they ended up meeting the doctors, working with them, and they became part of this. They became the first nurses in Georgia and South Carolina, and up north you actually had lay women who were interested in nursing and started expressing this. But in the South, there was much more constrained roles of women. They weren't seen out in public doing things like this. They were supposed to be in the home, the cult of domesticity, and all that. So they actually punched above their weight really big in the South, in the deep South, because of the restricted roles of women. But religious women were allowed to do these things without approbation. So it was just and it was an opportunity they seized and really ran with. And they were able to do a lot. They started the first school systems, the first hospitals. And so I was just really impressed with that. And one thing, the success of it, I mean, I was raised Catholic, but like a lot of Catholics now, I'm disillusioned with the church, and particularly what they've done with the priesthood, and more it just seems that there's a large faction of the old line in Europe that just doesn't want women to have any power ecclesiastically, And so it's, I know a lot of friends like that aren't as active as they used to be on a formal basis, but they carry, the teachings and all that we've had, primarily from women, with us through our lives, and we try to, live life according to those principles, but without the mandate of the Catholic Church or even the approval of them.
Let me ask, let's talk about those principles. What are those principles that these women, nuns, have inculcated? Is that a fair word?
Yeah.
Into the Catholic community that continues to, what are those?
Well, the thing that was really amazed me, and I was so lucky that I read this one article that guided me to this soldier who was from Texas in the Civil War. He was wounded at Chickamauga. 3 days later, he ends up on a rail car in Augusta. He was shot through the foot, and it was gangrenous. And Augusta had maybe 750 hospital beds. They had 10,000 wounded. So the doctors were just exhausted, and all they wanted to do when they saw a wound like that was amputate, get it out of them. And he begged them not to. And one of the sisters, and they came up, at that point they had a branch house in Augusta. And they had worked closely with the doctors in the medical schools there during epidemics and things like that. So they sent sisters on rail cars up to Augusta, and they ended up forming the 3rd Georgia Hospital, and they were treating them in there. And they heard this man begging to say, and they asked if they could attempt to healing. So the surgeons let him, and they ended up saving his leg. Well, it was amazing because this guy didn't have any formal education. His name was Bill Fletcher. By the turn of the century, he was the wealthiest man in Texas. The two, he exported the first load of yellow pine in America, and he invented some of the first industrial logging equipment. And so in the first two phone lines in the state of Texas were run between two of his mills. And so this is in the late 1890s. He decided, well, I've always wanted to do something to repay what these religious women did for me. And so in being a Protestant, he had no idea of the differences in the religious orders or anything. So he goes to the Sisters of Charity in Beaumont and says, I want to build a hospital for you. So, and at that time, there was no hospital either in West Louisiana or East Texas. So he logged the timber, milled it, built the hospital, and for 40 years, he and his family would take clothing and food and money at Christmas. They'd load wagons up and drive. And I actually met his granddaughter. She came to the Irish Festival when I was working there, and she spoke on our cultural stage and ended up inviting me to go out to Beaumont, and I addressed a group of Boy Scouts at a convention there, and it was basically about what so impressed her grandfather, Bill Fletcher, about the religious order. And it's funny because the more I got into it, the more I researched not just him, but the topic. What was interesting was that a lot of these soldiers that came from rural areas, they'd never met Catholics, and they'd been taught all these things, that weren't necessarily true, and so they. And he said, I've been taught by all the old ladies back home, black and white, that there was no place in heaven for a Catholic. And it was like, but what was really amazing about it, this is what really struck me, and this is what I told the scouts. What they were instructed by their superiors was never to let the Catholicity of their order, the pieties and the daily routines you go through the rule, never let that interfere with their acts of mercy. And so when you see inevitably these Protestants, and many of them ended up converting, but they'd never said, I want to be a Catholic. They said, I want to be in the religion of the sisters. So the practical aspect of it and the basis of it is the teachings of Christ and the life of Christ. That you look out for the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, all these things. And that's what they did. So what these Protestants encountered was not what they thought was Catholicism. They thought this was the essence of Christianity. So, and it was just, I got to go see Bill Fletcher's grave. We went out to the cemetery. I mean, he donated a ton of money to the University of Texas, but it was really interesting. When he died in 1915, now this was the year Birth of a Nation was brought in and was shown in the White House by Woodrow Wilson. At his funeral, there were large numbers of Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Black Americans. So he was not affiliated with any particular Protestant sect. But he was a very deeply spiritual man, it really amazed me. None of his family converted to Catholicism, but every year they would take these wagons full of food, clothing, and money to the sisters in Beaumont to keep their hospital going and for them to do the outreach they were doing to the citizens in those states.
So you're tying, if I understand it right, you're tying a war injury that happened during the Civil War,
Yes,
right? And nuns were, I think in your words, the sisters were sent up to Augusta,
right,
and I'm assuming some of those were sisters from here.
right.
And
Oh yeah,
yes,
they were all from
they
Savannah.
were from here, and they saved his foot.
Right.
And in 1950,
1915 was when he died.
when he died,
Yeah.
right? He died in 1915, and the birth of a nation was being shown at the White House.
Right.
And do you mind, for our viewers, a little about what is the birth of the nation?
The Birth of the Nation was a film that was it actually what it's touted as doing is the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century. By the late 19th century, by the late 1880s or so, even Bedford Forrest, who is attributed with forming the Klan, had washed his hands of them. It was not what they were. They weren't looking for this, alternative military terrorist organization initially. And when it became that, a bunch of the ones who formed it just walked away from it, and it kind of went underground. But in the early 20th century, and you had a lot of the immigrants now that were coming from Eastern Europe, Jews, Czechoslovakians, all kinds of people that the country had not seen in large numbers on before. And you had another incidence of the nativism that was coming out. And so the film portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as protecting the white race, particularly women, from the lies that would come out, basically attributed to the nature of black men and the threats they pose to white women, and so the fact that this was shown so openly and really embraced by Woodrow Wilson, who was originally from Augusta. And as early, and he was from North Augusta there, right? And so it was really shocking in a way to see. And I mean, it was nakedly racist. It wasn't. They didn't pull any punches.
I'll be honest. The story is so it's stunning.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to catch my bearings a little bit to make this connection between a man's foot.
Yeah.
That has to be saved, and then the
Well,
role he played in for the rest of his life.
Well, it's interesting because when he writes about it in his memoir, he wrote a memoir about it, and I've got some copies. I'll get you a copy of it. But you can imagine if you were in the war, you haven't been home, you haven't seen your mother, your wife, your sister, you hadn't been around a lot of women, and all of a sudden you're wounded. And he said it. He spoke of the accent, the Irish brogue, and the fact that they were so concerned with him and took the time and the effort to get rid of the gangrene and to save his leg. And he said, I fell in love with the accent and the uniform, as he called it, that they wore. And he said, I haven't got over it yet. This was in the 20th century, early 20th century. So. I mean, in a lot of ways, they probably would have reacted to any kindness that was shown to them, and a lot, but they were particularly impressed. And it wasn't, and it was interesting because it wasn't just the Protestants in the Southern Army. A lot of them that were in the Union Army, you had whole regiments that were formed by abolitionists, and they did a bunch of damage to Catholic property, and you had one of the major generals up in Memphis when they captured Vicksburg. He refused to feed the Irish orphans. He wouldn't allow rations for the orphans, and even though the group of nuns that were there were from Pennsylvania, but he was an abolitionist. He had a very mean nativist streak, and so he had to be ordered by the high command to feed these orphans. And I mean that's the kind of but yet there was several of the sisters that came here. They had relatives that went to Charleston. They're either siblings or cousins, and they would communicate back and forth. And it was interesting because some of them treated wounded that eventually were sent down into South Georgia into prison and died in Andersonville. And in Savannah, they were sent, a lot of them who were near death, and they nursed them back to life in Savannah before they transferred them back up north, and they would go through this. So they were treating these Union soldiers, including the black Union soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts who survived or were captured on Battery Wagner, the fighting around Charleston in 1863. And there was one Union soldier, officer, wrote to the sisters, and it was a really amazing letter. But he said that, just like what Bill Fletcher said, he said, I've always been taught that there was nothing good to come from the Catholic Church. And he said, but I have to admit that if Christianity exists on this earth, it certainly exists in your religious order. And so they had so many letters written from Union prisoners and wounded that they actually paid, I think it was about $12,000 to the sisterhood in Charleston to repair some of their buildings that were damaged in the shelling of the Battle of Charleston Harbor.
You had mentioned, I was curious, you mentioned you worked on the docks.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about working on the docks, I think about the ILA, I think it's 1515. And I think about that as kind of an African-American world, if you will.
Right.
Relationship between the Irish Catholic community and the black community, particularly with regard to this idea of interdenominational, or the way that the Catholic community has been important to other communities in Savannah.
Well, when I was real young, and I'd go down to my grandparents', I mean, there were a lot of times there were men who would come up, either singly or two or three of them, begging for food or help. And I'd say most of them were black, but there were whites as well. And it was so odd to me because it was something I couldn't really understand. I didn't know why were they in this? Why did this happen? How come they were like this? But my grandmother would feed them, and she would keep my little foods set aside, kind of waiting on them, sometimes. And it got bad. I think a woman had gotten raped at the end of the street there by a black man, and so my grandfather and my uncles were always telling her, you got to quit doing this. You're just going to bring trouble. And so if it was getting, if it was late in the afternoon when they might be coming home or something, she would and I'll never forget this one time. There were two of them came up, and she was concerned that either some of her boys or my grandfather was going to be coming home soon. And there was a Chinaman's little store on Price, on like Gaston Lane on Price Street, that faced Price Street. And she told him to go around there, and she gave me a nickel and gave me a bag of like these old hot dogs she'd been holding and stuff and all. And I ran around there and gave the food to these guys, and got me a creamsicle. And but I can remember, how and my aunts who became nuns both told me that during the Depression, she said they would mark the curb in front of your house to show that it was a good place to try your luck, And so I can remember that from God. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and I mean.
Is it possibly that's one of your first memories, period?
Yeah, and it's very much so, and it's funny because she was clairvoyant. That's what I mean. She was old school, She was old world, and so we'd ride the bus with her and things like that. But I mean, I can remember walking to the cathedral, and that's what I really miss about Savannah was when the historic district was lived in, and it was part of your daily life, and and it wasn't just for tourists or that sort of thing.
It was a different day.
It was indeed, yes.
Yeah.
But I can remember, the ones that did come by and how they were taken care of, and that always stuck with me.
Through the years, have you, I mean, just in your own personal life, have there been times when you have reached out and either organizationally or personally just reached out and done what needed to be done for someone else?
Yeah, and to me that was more interesting than some of the organized stuff that just gets kind of lost in the bureaucratic weeds. That kind of, but when there was a couple of black women that used to cook for this organization I was in, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, at the Irish Festival, and I worked with them at Kevin Barry's, and this was when I was going to school, and I worked in the kitchen with them, and I basically took out the garbage and stuff like that, and so the one woman had a absolutely horrible thing happen. Her daughter got divorced and moved in with her 3 young sons. 2 of them were toddlers, and then one night, and Cheryl was working at that night at Kevin Barry's. The daughter it was a sitter there watching the kids, and she went out to this little club there on Waters Avenue and to dance, and was being pestered by this younger guy that was there, and she finally, I guess, embarrassed him in front of, and he waited outside and shot her in the head when she came out. So when my friend is coming home from work, she sees the tape in the parking lot there and knew something bad had happened, and she got a block further to her place on 40th Street, and the daughter wasn't there, and the sitter was like, I don't know, she was supposed to be back. And she went over there, and I don't know if you can remember this, Tom, but it was a notorious case in a way. The body was not accepted by Memorial, who was trying to get the city to demand that the other hospitals take a bigger share of the indigent load. So it was sent to Candler. Hours later, it was sent back to me. And this happened for like 6 hours. And finally, Memorial took the body and processed it. So here's this woman now trying to raise her 3 grandsons and work. She still had to work and all this stuff. Well, coming up on Easter, she was cooking Easter dinner, and the pot was on the stove, and it spilled into fluid. She had third-degree burns on her feet. Then, maybe 6 months later, she had a massive stroke, and one that, I mean, it, she never recovered from fully. She had to learn to talk and walk again. One side was completely paralyzed, and it went through just this nightmare of bureaucracy. We thought we were doing a good thing. I got a friend of mine in the AOH, Joe Mulheron, who's a lawyer. He got me in touch with a woman who specialized in Social Security, and we got her on Social Security, but lo and behold, because that would be like, I think, $750 a month they were going to give her, that meant that now she wasn't eligible for the medicine she was getting that she had to have for the stroke and all. And so it was like you giving with one hand, taking with the other. And so I got a few people together, and we started just giving her supplemental money each month. And so I went by there one night just to check on her and see how the kids were doing and all this. And she's cooking dinner in the kitchen. And I mean, it's real difficult for her to get around. They're still, And so I'm walking behind her while she's standing at the stove, and there was a little throw rug and when I stepped on it, I went all the way to my hip. It was covering a hole. And I was like, and I said, God, Cheryl, what? And she goes, oh, that. So I went to an AOH meeting, and I said, look, we all know this lady. She's helped us tremendously at the Irish Festival, and a lot of y'all know her from Kevin Barry's and this sort of thing. So one of my friends there that I grew up with, actually, it was a contractor, and he said, and I was telling him what had happened, and my wife, Teresa Wexel, she's a civil engineer. She went under the house and identified all the rotting pieces and things that needed to be replaced and this sort of thing. So my friend, he said he would bring a crew one Saturday. We'd get together, and then we broadened it. When we went to the house and looked at it, he said, we need to get her a new kitchen. So we got a gas stove, a refrigerator, all that to replace, but then we had to, but what was so cool, the day it happened, my friend shows up, and the labor he brings with him are 5 young Hispanic men who were from a little town in Mexico, a couple hours from Mexico City. And it was so neat because we had to go under the house. We had to jack it up. We had to remove all the rotting stuff and all. I mean, it took all day, and it was difficult work. And then after that, we had to refloor the kitchen and then put the appliances in there and all that. And about halfway through this, and then by this time, we're said the kids are still in the house and all. And so my friend came up to me and he goes, hey, I got some good news. And I said, what's that? And he goes, his workers, the Hispanic guys, the Mexican boys, they said they didn't want to be paid. So, so we finished doing the work and all that, and I ended up, and Cheryl wanted to cook for them, but I mean, they were filthy. It was getting dark, man. So I told them, I said, my brother still had the restaurant at Wausau Sound Seafood down, so I took him over there and was just sitting with him talking, and I really didn't know what to say. I just thanked him. And the one fellow who was kind of like the foreman who spoke English a little better, he said, I said, it was a good thing you did that today, and he goes, well, he said, maybe one day we might need help. And somebody will help us.
There it lay. Yeah. This has been an amazing interview, and I'll tell you why. Because we didn't have to look at the paper once. Not once. I think we should stop it right here.
Okay.
I mean, we could talk for 10 hours,
Oh, yeah.
and we may get there.
And you know, one thing I wanted, while it's on my mind, I wanted, you asked for a reference for
Yeah,
anybody.
please.
And the gentleman, my friend that had the construction company, Billy Bremer, he has done not only work, he's gone to Africa and built houses for people. And I don't know if it was through Habitat for Humanity, you know, but he's done, he's very much, now he doesn't live in Savannah anymore. He's a little south, right down around Midway now. But I'm sure he'd be willing to participate in something.
Oddly enough, we lived down the street from each other for a little while. And a childhood memory I have is we were playing in the First Scots patio, and he got a fish hook stuck in his heel.
Oh,
And his mother, Caroline,
Caroline, yeah.
was a piece of work.
Yes, she was.
Caroline yanked that thing out like it didn't matter, and he howled. And I remember, you know, saying, I mean, oh Lord, I'm glad she ain't my mama. But I mean, that's for me one of those memories. I can close my eyes and see that.
Oh my God, that
When you
hurts
say
to
Billy
think.
Bremer, that's where my mind goes. Oh, that's great.
But he's active in
That's good to know.
charitable work,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
a
yeah.
lot of it's related to religious activity.
And then just so again for our listeners, AOH is the
Ancient Order of Hibernians, yeah, not to be confused with the Hibernian Society. And it's an Irish organization that is peculiarly Catholic. It was formed in the 19th century in response to nativist attacks. Initially, it was an underground society. And and when I was doing my research, I actually wrote to the AOH chapter in New York, the head of, and asked them what the earliest record was in Savannah. And because I couldn't get anything before 1880. But he said at an 1850 or 1854 convention in New Orleans that they actually had 2 representatives come from Savannah. So it was an underground society here even then, and didn't really emerge into the light till after the war.
your grandmother in a way ran a little underground operation.
Yeah, she
right?
did.
She ran a little underground operation.
Yeah.
And you happened to see it.
Yeah,
And it turned you in some ways into who you have become.
exactly.
That'd be fair.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I have no idea what to expect, but this was beyond expectation in so many ways, because it is not criticism, but you know, we've had 2 interviews before you, and they've been wonderful, but they have not been personal. And we've got to have it all. And
Right.
in my experience, it's harder to get the deeply personal than it is. I mean, people love
Yeah.
talking about what other people are doing,
Right.
this organization or that organization.
Right.
But to be able to hear this thread of how a person's deep faith, your grandmother sounds like she was almost a mystic. I mean, in the deepest mystical beginnings of the faith, and how it just has flowed forward.
Yeah, it's funny because the Buttimer name is not a true Irish name. They went to Ireland in one of the plantations in the mid-16th century and became, as the English would say, more Irish than the Irish. They were the biggest pain in the ass because, and ended up coming to America, where her maiden name, Deegan, that is an ancient Irish name, and around the Waterford area. And but she had a lot more of the old world to her, you know. And she knew more about my grandfather's family than he did because she stayed at home with his mother and sisters, and they would speak at night about the old days in Ireland and that stuff. And my grandfather would have to refer to her to get information on his own family.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's also interesting, just as a side note, this won't, but Bobby Henson, who was in earlier, you know, Stevie Bryan here, real close.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You're close with
Yeah.
Stevie. And so you've got this little Jewish kid, you know, he's about 4 feet tall, you know, and you, and I mean, there's a whole thing going on there about how tightly knit that generationally.
Yeah.
And that would go back to, for you and Steve, to BC.
To the ninth grade, yeah. And of course back then he was really so cool because he was in the band, you know, he was in the Checkmates.
Right.
I mean, my God,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
and we would go to the Battle of the Bands to see him, and
Yeah.
so,
But that kind of that example of Benedictine being a place where people from different faiths
Right.
did show up.
Right.
And, you know, just to say it, there's
Right.
something about a BC boy. If you go into BC, you become a BC, my experience, you become a BC boy, and that's a tight bond.
you know, it is. And I don't know. Do you have somebody coming in? Do we need to?
We can,
No, I'm just saying it's what I was riding by there one day, Tom. This is in the student parking lot. You know, I made pretty good money on the docks, but I'm looking over there, and there's a brand new mint Sierra truck, a GM Sierra truck with a lift kit with the oversized tires on it, hooked up to a trailer, pulling a golf cart in the student park. And I'm sitting there going, God damn, I've never had a truck like that. And I'm like, you know, but I mean, the money now, and it's, you know, when I was there, when Stephen and I were there, it was $350 a year. We could make that during the summer. My brothers and I, we paid for our own way for, you know, and now it's like 15 grand or so. And I mean, it's a different world. And the Irish have, they've forgotten where they came from in a lot of ways to me. You know, I mean, when we were kids, you know, like the neighborhood I lived in, halfway down the street, there was a guy that had a hardware store. He might have been a millionaire, but he lived in the same neighborhood, you know, his kids went to the same schools. It was like, you know, it was just a different time.
The we was a The we was a bigger we.
Right,
than
exactly.
Right now, I mean,
Yeah.
we is flipped back to me, and
Yes.
and that does come in cycles, and we're in the me cycle right now.
Well, this novel, it deals with what was amazing when I was doing my research on the sisterhood. They lasted from 1845 to 1893, and then they affiliated with the Sisters of Mercy, which they are now. And they were kind of bullied into doing it by this hierarchy that was coming from Europe and telling them they needed to be affiliated with a real religious order, like, you know. And so it was during this time, from 1890 to 1920, all the archives of newspapers that were in Washington, there was a big fire, they all burned. So I'm trying to find out personal information about the last group of women who are now American-born, first generation American-born. So I'm going. I had to go through every newspaper for like 3 months that summer. I was up in the store, and I found this history that just blew me away about the first integrated parade in the city of Georgia, the first Labor Day parade in the city of Georgia. These two unions together, the black and the Irish, that, you know, and the how they came, and a lot of it came from the work that the women did, because St. Joseph's Infirmary was the first hospital in the state that treated blacks and whites under one roof. It was a separate ward, but they were in the same institution. In any other city, there probably would have been riots. But in Savannah, Savannah has been so pragmatic and just so, what works. And they've been a lot more tolerant too. And I think Martin Luther King recognized that when he came here. And I think this is part of the reason why there's a reservoir of historical good feeling between the Irish and the blacks, the Jews and the blacks, the Greek community and the blacks. It's because of what they have learned from their fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, and all this, of the ties from long ago.
Well, the story about how when Malcolm McLean brought the bishop,
Yeah.
the committee of 100, the bishop, it was Malcolm and whoever the bishop was at that time, they built a committee of 100 of 50 white people, 50 white people, and methodically desegregated the city.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be
Yeah.
another example of what you're describing.
No, I know it's and Savannah's been blessed in that sense. I mean, it's had some good practical leadership, and for some reason, a lot of the flamethrowers went to other cities, evidently. But it's been even when you compare it to like Charleston and stuff, I mean, in places like that, it's got its own charm in a social sense. I think our social history is second to none. Because one thing in the future anyway, one of the main things that did not happen anywhere else in America, the Catholic schools were founded before the war. After the war, the federal mandate was you had to have a school system. You had to start educating, not just the white kids, but the blacks as well. And so, out of necessity, they converted the Catholic schools into public schools. And the Catholics would show up 30 minutes early for religious instruction, and then whatever the rest of the day. The only other state that tried it was Minnesota, and it only lasted 3 years. Very contentious. Nowhere else. 40 years in Savannah. 40 years they had Catholic public schools, and it didn't happen anywhere else. It was just here, and it was because of the pragmatism, I think, and nobody objected to. And then when it ended was right around 1915. When the rebirth of the Klan, they started attacking Catholic institutions and things like this. In fact, they were really, really anti-Catholic then because they blamed the mayor of Augusta for the leader of the populists, Tom Watson, losing the governorship of Georgia. They said that more people voted in Augusta than lived there. They might have been right.
Right. Well, thank you. And, oh my gracious, there's so much more. Well, I'll talk to these guys.
Okay.
We need to figure this out because there's so much more that you can help us with. But I can't tell you how much I appreciate that story about how as time went by, this very personal way of being present to people and doing the right thing by people who are pushed to the edge.
Yeah.
I mean, that you don't get to hear much of that.
Well, thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank you.